very difficult for them to challenge any element of perceived unfairness about how they're being treated. And um, the present structures that exist clearly do not serve them well. I mean, I realise that there is representative bodies like the GRA and the AGSI, but I would have to say our experience from dealing with a lot of Gardaí in Ireland over the last couple of years is that they don't feel well represented by the GRA or the AGSI. And this is a big problem for them. And when they have a problem, I mean, most of them wouldn't even dream of going near the likes of the GRA, who seem just to represent themselves rather than represent the Gardaí. And I was actually a bit shocked yesterday when I see where Assistant Commissioner Fintan Fanning feels obliged to go to the courts now to address an issue that he's had when he was being interviewed for the Deputy Commissioner's job, and where he claims that Noel O'Sullivan asked him what were his thoughts on extreme left-wing politics in Ireland and left-wing politicians. By all accounts, Fintan Fanning was a bit shocked by this and felt that it was a very unfair question, but he doesn't really have a place to go with his complaint outside the courts, and you'd imagine that things should be different. Now, I raised in the Dáil here a few months ago as well the fact that a new recruit to the Garda Association wrote to me and complained about the fact that they were being asked to start working on just over 23,000 a year. Now, new recruits, if a new Garda, more than likely isn't going to be based in his own village. He isn't going to be, even if he is single, the chances of being able to stay living with his family are very, very slim. And so what he's going to have to do, he's more than likely going to need, given the difficulties with public transport in Ireland, where you're able to get from big city to big city or big town to big town, but if you start crisscrossing anywhere in Ireland and depending on public transport, it's very, very disappointing. And any guard, it'd be very hard to imagine how he wouldn't need a car. And also, more than likely, he'll have to get accommodation. He'll have to rent somewhere. Now, if a guy is going to have to buy a car and he's going to have to rent, now, I don't know how he's going to survive on just over 23,000 a year. I think it's very, very difficult. And I think this is something that should be addressed. But I mean, they don't really have anywhere to go with that. And I think that's unfair. And I did notice that the Germans and the Norwegians do allow trade unions. And I think it would be good if the Irish state were to actually just look at to see how the Germans and the Norwegians facilitate that without fear of, obviously, any state would be afraid that there wasn't a policeman to be had and they were all out on strike. Now, I understand they're not allowed to strike, but I think it does mean that police people in Germany and Norway have far better representation than our own police here. I just finish off on a different point. Sadly, because many guards don't feel that they have a body to go to, they don't have a body that really represents them. I mean, they've been coming to the likes of myself and Deputy Daly on an ongoing basis. There's hardly a week goes by now where there's some Gardaí coming to us with complaints, and it's very interesting that we've been ridiculed for raising some of these issues in the Parliament, and we're being accused of abusing our parliamentary privilege, which is really interesting. And I also got a very nasty letter from the GRA when I mentioned some issues going on with regard to policing and a publican in Kilkenny over a 6-year period. But what the GRA didn't seem to notice or take note of was the fact that this particular publican, after 6 years of unbelievable harassment, funny enough, the harassment has stopped since I raised it in here. Now, isn't that very interesting? And not only that, but it turns out that even though a lot of his complaints were out of time because of the restrictions in GSOC are upholding his complaints that were within time and are investigating them, which is good news. But no, just to finish off, I welcome Deputy McNamara's bill. I think it's a subject that deserves some serious discussion and some serious thought on the part of the government. Thank you very much, and I appreciate being let in, even though we were late. Thanks very much again.
Thank you, Deputy. The next speaker is Deputy Claire Daly.
Again, thanks very much, Chair, and I too would like to welcome Deputy McNamara's efforts, and I am appreciative of the opportunity to make a few short points in support of it. The first time I had a chance to vote, not today or yesterday, was an opportunity to vote for candidates who stood under the banner of the Army Wives in Kildare, where I'm from, in the 1980s. And that campaign really was the forerunner by the spouses of soldiers to agitate and put on the table very legitimate concerns that Defence Forces personnel had about their wages, about their conditions and so on, which traditionally have been and are today relatively poor, to be honest, in terms of the lack of adequate pay and respect and a voice for our soldiers. And obviously I use my vote to support them, and out of their campaign actually PD Fora emerged as a representative organisation for Army personnel, and I think that has been a hugely positive experience, but I don't think it's enough. I think they have been good at agitating, at putting in the spotlight the very poor conditions of soldiers, where we're on record on the House of saying that numerous soldiers' families have to secure family income supplement to make ends meet. We've had the stories of soldiers sleeping in their cars because barracks have been shut down and allowances haven't been sufficient to enable them to get accommodation and so on. And the idea that these people are not workers, that they're somehow apart, is something that really, I suppose, capitalism as a method of organising society has done, attempted to put guards and soldiers as being separate from other workers. But I do support the idea that they are just workers in uniform, and in that sense their allegiance should be with their fellow workers, and that they should have the right to be represented by a trade union in a real sense. And I think that's important, not just from the point of view of them having the ability to advance their economic position, which I think all workers should have. I think it's doubly the case, as Deputy Wallace said, in this era of austerity, where we have starting rates now for Gardaí and Army personnel which are quite simply an absolute joke. There's a downgrading of these jobs which should be remunerated better than they are. And I find it sickening in the extreme that so-called representative organisations that masquerade as supporting rank-and-file Gardaí would be silent largely on the appalling cutbacks in Garda pay and conditions, and yet are vociferous in their criticisms of those of us in here who try and raise issues of Garda reform. And the idea that Gardaí don't need serious trade union representation, I think, is the argument is won by the inaction of the GRA and the AGSI, who simply, you know, it's funny, I've been a shop steward, still am actually, for many decades, and you often hear workers criticising shop stewards and union officials as being apart from their members, not sufficiently agitating enough for their members' needs and objectives, and that is quite often the case. I think it's really the case in terms of the GRA and the AGSI, who seem to be using that organisation as maybe a vehicle for promoting themselves or something. It's certainly not being used to challenge management by any stretch. And I think that was really vindicated at the time of the GSOC bugging scandals and so on, when former Commissioner Callanan contacted the 4 Garda representative organisations and asked them to put out a statement condemning GSOC and saying they'd no confidence in GSOC, and the AGSI and the GRA happily obliged. They weren't so quick at coming out supporting their own members who stood against the tide, who put the spotlight on some terrible abuses that were being undertaken by some senior Gardaí against citizens and indeed against other Gardaí, and they've been shamefully quiet about some of their own members who, as we speak now, are still in the force and are still enduring poor behaviour because of speaking out about bad practices. So I think this is a really timely, actually, piece of legislation. I think it's very necessary, because we only have to look around at what's been attempted to be done in terms of, say, the water charges protest, for example, where we have been in contact with some senior Gardaí who've actually been very disappointed that they've been asked to ask their members to go out and police and stand watch on the community, in communities where for years they've been attempting to build proper, decent community relations, and yet they've been pitted against residents at a time when they prefer to be out dealing with crime and doing the job that some of them signed up to do. And that's a very, very dangerous undermining of the Gardaí. It's undermining the conditions of decent Gardaí who signed up to do a good job and who don't want to be pitted against their neighbours and friends. And the only way in which these people can have a voice is if they're given proper trade union rights and a protection to be able to take a stand. And I do support the right to strike of Defence Forces personnel and indeed of the Gardaí as well, because I do think that they should see their role as being serving the community and standing alongside residents, not being pitted and apart from their neighbours and friends. So I welcome the debate. I'm glad that it's going on. I think it's important that we advance these issues, and I compliment Deputy McNamara for bringing forward the legislation today.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy McNamara, you have 10 minutes as the proposer to reply.
Firstly, address some points that were raised on the floor. The Minister said that the right to strike of Garda Síochána, which was decided that Ireland was in breach of the European Social Charter because it was denied, raised very serious issues. And I do accept that for the security of the state, etc. Deputy Cleary went further and ruled it out and said it was incompatible with the security of the state. Now, I fully accept that the state needs to be secure at all times and public order needs to be maintained at all times. But I doubt very much that that thought and that concern didn't occur to the European Social Rights Committee when they were making their decision. And they've made their decision. They've made it clearly. Now, we need a health service which functions at all times. But nurses can go on strike. And we don't have the LDF or the FCA or enlisted members of the army handing scalpels to surgeons in theatres. Because essential services are maintained through strikes. In Germany, many countries. You know, it's not, the two aren't incompatible. Maintaining a health service while allowing people who work in the health service to go on strike is not anathema. It's possible. Maintaining the security of the state while allowing Gardaí to go on strike is equally possible. Now, I want to also take issue with this whole idea that there was a strong dissenting opinion, and there was a very strong dissenting opinion. But there was a very strong dissenting opinion last week in the Supreme Court by Mr. Justice Hardiman. Now, does that mean that evidence illegally obtained, albeit inadvertently, but illegally obtained by Garda Síochána, won't be used in prosecutions from now on in the state? Of course it doesn't, because judgments stand. That's what dissenting and strong dissenting opinions, they're exactly that, but nevertheless a majority decision is reached, and that stands. Now, I want to take issue with this idea that it's not legally binding. I'm reminded of Deputy Lucinda Creighton. I was here at the time, I think she was there, when she talked about the ABC judgment not being legally binding in Ireland. Well, Minister, there's an expression in Clare, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. You know, we didn't go over to Europe or to the Committee of Ministers and say that this decision wasn't legally binding. I think that's just for domestic consumption. What we said was We can assure this committee, however, the Committee of Ministers, that Ireland takes careful note of the findings of the European Committee on Social Rights on these issues, and they will be fully considered. In this regard, Ireland is committed to engagement with all relevant parties on these issues with a view to seeking solutions which respect the Charter. Because we have an a binding international legal commitment to respect the Charter. Even when, judgments or decisions are made against us. That's the rule of law, and we signed up to the commitments in that, and therefore we have to respect them. In part of your contribution, Minister, you talked about the Constitution of ICTU and the requirement to carry out all actions compatible or necessary for the function of trade union, all actions compatible with the performance of trade union functions. And I want to take issue with what Deputy Wallace said. It is not proposed that An Garda Síochána be allowed to join trade unions, because the European Social Committee specifically said that Ireland was not in breach because they couldn't join trade unions. It said that the associations which they can join have to be given greater powers of collective bargaining, to affiliate with ICTU, etc. But it didn't say that they had to become trade unions. And I don't think that PD4A, and I'm not proposing that PD4A be allowed to become a trade union. And of course, an inevitable part of a trade union is that you strike. I'm not proposing that. And I suppose it's sometimes, there's a tendency, I think, particularly with private members' bills, to conflate or to slightly misrepresent. And I appreciate it's not intentional, but maybe to misrepresent what's proposed. I'm not proposing the PD4 or RACO. I'm not even proposing that RACO be ordered or be made to affiliate with ICTU either, because that runs contrary to the freedom of association, and the contrary to that, or the inevitable part of that, is that you have a freedom to dissociate yourself. If RACO don't want to affiliate with ICTU, I don't think in any way they should be forced to, but I think if PD4 do want to, they should be facilitated in doing so. And I think that they would act responsibly if they were allowed to join. I think if there are particular concerns, they could be dealt with at committee stage. But I suppose, yeah, this trade union, I mean, I thank both Deputy Daly and Deputy Wallace for their contributions. I suppose at the beginning of your contribution you talked about our experience as being Deputy Wallace, and for a while I wondered who our was and whether there was a sort of a royal prerogative emanating from Wexford, or whether maybe the purple T-shirt might be swapped for a purple gown at some point with a little bit of ermine in the hem. But anyway, I'm glad that it became clear what exactly you meant as you went through your contribution. But turning to, I suppose, more serious matters, you see, as I said in my contribution, the European Committee, the Council of Europe's Committee of Ministers, specifically said that Ireland would undertake a review of its law and practice with the view to bring it into compliance with the Charter. And I suppose the question is, where does a review of laws take place? You see, because there's a principle in this state, and that's that laws are made exclusively by the democratically elected representatives of the people, and that principle is contained in Article 25.2.1 of the Constitution. Arguably, it was for that right, for democratically elected representatives of the people to make law, that this state obtained its independence, that the Irish Republican Army, and in the first Dáil, recalled that the Irish Republic was proclaimed on Easter Monday 1916 by the Irish Republican Army, and it proclaimed, "We ordained that the elected representatives of the Irish people alone have power to make laws binding on the people of Ireland." And it was for this principle that the Irish Republican Army fought a war of independence. And their successors, and it's important to bear in mind that the only successors of the Irish Republican Army are the current Óglaigh na hÉireann, who patrol this House. They patrol it over the weekend, and they patrol it every night. And they'll defend it and guard it with their lives if necessary, because that's what armies do. But they didn't do that to be second-class citizens. They did it to be citizens in uniform. And there's a big difference in that regard. But as I said, armies all over the world protect democratic institutions. That's what armies do. But this institution, this parliament, I think, is a little bit different to parliaments anywhere else in the world, because here, laws aren't debated and decided upon here in this chamber. They're debated and decided upon elsewhere, in Cabinet. And I appreciate that the government has a position on this bill. But, you know, maybe we should have a legislature which legislates, and an executive which executes that which the legislature decides. You know, Barry Desmond a former Labour TD and a former Labour minister, had this to say: "The public has little solid information on how the Cabinet reaches major decisions, except that the motivating influence is usually short-term political expediency. In effect, the 15 Cabinet members singly and sometimes severally run the show. There's a grave need for some parliamentary devices whereby the Dáil is clearly in a position to debate Cabinet decisions." Now, I'm going to omit a couple of paragraphs of what he said because of time constraints, but he said, "I've rarely met a government minister who, once in office, has shown any urgent personal concern about Dáil reform. Of course, some ministers, when in opposition, showed a lively interest in the topic. Dáil Éireann is therefore, to many observers, a sleepily middle-class, quasi-professional, male-dominated, conservatively deliberative, poorly attended debating chamber. Deputies play less and less a role in the formation and enactment of legislation, and more occupy their time in the pretence of political favour peddlers, consumer representatives, and clerical messenger boys on behalf of constituents." Now, I suppose the surprising part of that is that he said this in 1975. So, plus song, plus LMM shows. But this Dáil was going to change all that. And we were. I mean, we weren't just going to change the government. We were going to change the system of governance. We had a mandate from the people of Ireland, actually, to change all that. And I think the first sentence of the programme for government says, "On the 25th of February, a democratic revolution took place in Ireland. Old beliefs, traditions and expectations were blown away. The strike of a pen in thousands of polling stations created this political whirlwind. The public demanded change and looked to parties that would deliver the change they sought." And one of the most fundamental changes were how legislation was enacted, how we discussed it, how we did business here. That we empowered the Dáil because they were the democratically elected representatives of the people. That was what freedom was about. That was what freedom was sought for, so that we have the power to elect our own representatives. I see it 1 minute, yeah. We have the power to elect our own representatives and they'd make the laws. Not that they defer all that power to 15 wise men and women, or, well, mostly wise men and women anyway. Part of the programme for government talks that to carry out this task of Dáil reform, we must identify the fundamental goals of a properly functioning Dáil. These include to legislate to represent the people on issues of national concern and more effective financial scrutiny. And it said, in each of these headings, Dáil falls short, sometimes far short of what's required. We'll institute a programme of short-term and urgent Dáil reform within the existing constitution to make the Dáil fit for purpose. A couple of the proposals was that we will break the government monopoly on legislation and the stranglehold over the business of the Dáil by providing that new Friday sittings will be given over exclusively to committee reports and private members' business, except where urgent business must be taken. That's why we're here today, because the government allowed that. We'll also deal with the related problem of legislation being shunted through at high speed, and will ensure that Dáil standing orders provide a minimum of 2 weeks between each stage of the bill, except in exceptional circumstances. We won't comment on that because I think it doesn't really need any further comment. But part of allowing legislation to be enacted, particularly, and I thank the Minister for acknowledging that there is a point to this legislation and accepting that we need to engage with these issues. But part of that is that we allow the legislation, because no single piece of legislation that I'm aware of that's initiated by a backbencher, none has been enacted to date. None. Now, Deputy Shatter had private members' legislation enacted, so where's the revolution? Where's the reform? And I'll finish by, I think, reading one more sentence from Barry Desmond into the Dáil record. "The public pressures today for such reform is drearily dispirited. Where is that pressure which the Labour Party continuously showed in opposition? The discredited amateur approach of most of the Fine Gael parliamentarians to reform and the contentment of the Fianna Fáil party in opposition with the status quo is almost disturbing." Now, that was 40 years ago. I don't wish to digress from the purpose of the bill. I commend the bill to the House. I've discussed it in detail. I think the Minister accepts some of the proposals, but I do commend the bill to the House. Thank you,
Thank you, Deputy. I must now put the question that the bill be now read a second time. The Choctaw atá ar Haven na Tarishkina Abrish Tá, the Choctaw atá na Gwine Abrish Neil, Shirim Goil Bolshe ar an Kesh. In my opinion, the question is lost. The division is postponed until immediately after the order of business on Tuesday next in accordance with Standing Order 117, paragraph 1A. We'll now move on to committee report, motion report entitled Report on Land Use, Maximising its Potential. And the mover is, the report is being proposed by Deputy Andrew Doyle.
Thank you, Cathaoirleach. I move that Dáil notes
Move the motion.
Yes, I move that Dáil notes the report on the Joint Committee on Agriculture, Food and Marine entitled Report on Land Use Maximising Its Potential, which was laid before Dáil on the 20th of November 2014. And I'd like to thank the Ceann Comhairle and welcome the opportunity to outline the context, background and conclusion of the Joint Committee of Agriculture, Food and the Marine's report, which was published, as I said, last November. I'd like to also welcome the fact that Deputy Minister of State, Minister Tom Hayes, is present for this morning, or is it still this morning, to make his own remarks and observations on the committee's report. Just at the outset to say, the Joint Committee were determined that the voice of the committee and a range of stakeholders from Ireland be heard at this early stage of discussions on this particular issue, when outcomes can more realistically be influenced. As one expert pointed out to the committee during the hearings, changing land use is a slow process, not only in Ireland but internationally. That requires early engagement because it is difficult to manage. The time horizon that we're talking about here is between 2020 and 2050. The European Commission is preparing its own land use directive aimed at dealing with the challenges we will all be discussing. So we would like Ireland, we felt as a committee and all-party committee, we would like Ireland to be in a position to inform this process rather than be responding to it in a number of years from a defensive position. So that's basically the background to it. I suppose over the series of hearings held last year, the committee explored how best to balance 4 key demands for our land into the future, namely increasing food production under Food Harvest 2020, offsetting carbon, the provision of clean water, and lastly, the protection of habitats for biodiversity. And with that as the tenet of our exploration, if you want to call it that, of the issues, we benefit from the perspectives of the prominent experts from Coillte, Teagasc, the Directors General of the European Commission of various commissions, the Environmental Protection Agency, UCD School of Agriculture, Food and Science, and Bord na Móna. Their contributions played a key role in the formulation of the report, and I'd like to, on the record, thank them all for their participation. In particular, the Directors General from Europe, who we engaged with by means of a conference meeting in the committee rooms here, which we found very useful and can testify that it is an arrangement that can work. It finds that reaching our Food Harvest 2020 targets while staying within the environmental limits will be a major challenge. But the cross-party report is saying that with requisite government commitment and support from farming the community, the cross-party committee believes that the shorter-term challenges reaching Food Harvest 2020 targets and environmental commitments can be met. The committee acknowledged the importance of sustainable agriculture and land use, including afforestation and the use of agricultural soil as carbon sinks, as key considerations in ensuring coherence between the EU's food security and climate change objectives. Across the agri-sector, there are various programmes in place that can be harnessed to maximise land use. Numerous studies ongoing, and has been highlighted again and again that education and knowledge transfer is the key to seeing newest innovative systems and technology put to use at the farm level, emphasising financial rewards for farmers as well as environmental benefits of the various methods detailed all will help maximise land use potential. With this in mind, the key findings of the report include, amongst others, that further assessment of concepts such as sustainable intensification, which has become something of a buzzword, but nonetheless it's relevant, and offsetting or land sharing with a view to putting them into practice where possible. I suppose by that we could say that, and I just cite Deputy O'Quiv, who's present, could do the same in Galway, but in Wicklow we have a lot of highly productive land, but likewise we have a lot of land that is not interfered with its natural habitat, which can operate if it was used to offset the carbon output of more productive land. It all is actually, in fact, a very valuable carbon sink, and that's including forestry. The provision of grants for afforestation and bioenergy crops harness the high technology schemes and greening measure proposed under the new Common Agricultural Policy, which for the first time ever acknowledges the environment and greening in Pillar 1 payments. The need to foster knowledge transfer to farmers through upskilling for all agricultural and environmental farm advisors, and it was felt that discussion groups are in particular a very valuable way of actually getting knowledge across to as big a cohort as possible in the fastest and most efficient way. Encourage greater use of the discussion groups and including demonstration farms for this purpose. At farm level, support the use of low carbon food tools such as the Carbon Navigator, nutrient management planning, and avail of the best practice through participation in better farm programmes. The report was prepared shortly before an agreement was reached on a new EU climate and energy policy framework for the period to 2030, and that was at the European Council meeting held the 23rd and 24th of October. And just to quote what the EU leaders agreed on that day was that the domestic 2030 greenhouse gas reduction target of at least 40% compared to 1990, together with other main building blocks of the 2030 policy framework for climate change energy as proposed by the European Commission in January 2014. This 2030 policy framework aims to make European Union's economy and energy systems a more competitive, secure, sustainable, and also sets a target of at least 27% for renewable energy and energy savings by 2030. The conclusions of that meeting acknowledged the importance of sustainable agriculture and the land use sector, including afforestation, as a key consideration in ensuring coherence between the EU's security and climate change objectives. And in this context, I believe this report is very important and worthwhile in drawing attention to the research in relation to carbon sequestration through restoration of cutaway bogs and by soils and vegetation through changes in farming practices. As pointed out to us during the hearings, changing land use is a slow process. Changing land use policy is the beginning of it, but changing land use habits is slower. And every country that requires an early management because it is difficult to manage. Again, I emphasise that's why we decided to conduct the hearings and publish the report. But it is fair to say that after the publication of the EU's Council decisions, a new wave of discussion and debate has followed, as was probably predictable. But I would like to say that on the basis that we are, and all the expert opinion suggests, that we are going to need increased food from the same land base, possibly less because of water challenges across the globe. Water used for land, for food, and water used for people are actually going to be, in some areas of high density population, very competitive and possibly not possible to satisfy all. And we will definitely have new technology, new innovation with regard to the production of food and proteins in particular, both from the land and the sea. But it is important that facts rather than perception are the basis for the debate, that we have an honest debate, that we embrace everything that the Irish, in particular in our case, that the Irish land as a resource can actually do to mitigate carbon, to mitigate climate change, and to simply cut down on our output to achieve a lower percentage of our overall emissions is simplistic. As they say, lies, damn lies and statistics. We have one of the, we would contend, most efficient from a carbon emissions point of view, food production systems, particularly with regard to milk and beef. And we should protect that, because in the global context, simply by cutting our emissions, nothing is achieved if this food that's going to be needed is produced somewhere else at a greater cost to the environment. So once again, I'd like to thank all the members of the committee for their engagement in this, all the witnesses who came in before us, who helped us prepare the report, the people from the library and research in particular, and the committee secretariat for all of their support in producing what I think is a very valuable and important report. And at least, as I said at the outset, we're in at a stage where we're actually at the policy formation point rather than reacting to a policy that's published. And I think it's very important that we bear that in mind. Thank you.
The next speaker is the Minister, and you have 15 minutes.
Very much. First of all, I want to acknowledge the work of the committee in producing this report, and as the Chairman has already stated, the many people that were involved in the production of a very, very comprehensive report, and indeed to thank people opposite for their contribution to it as well. And I wish to assure you that the Department has taken full cognizance of the issues that you have raised throughout this report. There is no doubt that the global changes and demands that will impact on our agriculture and forest industries, this is indeed an important topic for discussion. I will address some pertinent issues. Addressing the challenges of sustainability and meeting the growing global food demands will not be an easy task. The global population has doubled since 1970 to 7 billion today, and if current trends are maintained, the global population will increase to over 9 billion by 2050. Today, 1 in 8 of the world's population of 870 million people do not have access to sufficient foods. The Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN estimated that global agricultural production will need to increase by up to 60% by 2050 from the 2005-2007 levels to meet the demands of forecast population growth and the food and nutritional demands of wealthier consumers. This equates to an extra production of over 1 billion tonnes of cereal and 200 million tonnes of meat. By 2050, the planet will need to produce 60% more food with less land, water and energy, while also reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Ireland has been a clear leader for some time at EU level in calling for recognition of the specific issues that arise in agriculture and forestry sector in relation to policy on climate change mitigation and adaptation. Last October, European Council's conclusions on the 2030 Climate and Energy Policy Framework were an important step forward in developing a coherent policy on food security and climate change. Ireland welcomes the conclusions which commit to examining how to encourage the substantial intensification of food production, and noted the role afforestation can play in carbon sequestration. This is very important for Ireland as we are leading the world in some of our climate change actions. Afforestation is a major greenhouse gas mitigation measure that we are taking on agricultural land, and it is essential that the EU's greenhouse gas accounting system should take care of the value of afforestation fully into account to encourage this real and additional mitigation. Officials in our department are continuing to work with colleagues in other departments to ensure a whole government approach to building upon the October text, and working with the Commission to ensure that EU climate and food policies to 2030 and beyond are coherent, consistent in recognising the reality of the global challenge that we are facing. Our cattle production, which is the mainstream of Irish agriculture, is very much based on sustainability principles. Some 90% of the diet of dairy and beef animals is composed of grass or silage that is grown on farm in permanent pasture on which the livestock are ultimately reared. The amount of imported inputs, such as fertilisers, is low and indeed reducing. This is in contrast to livestock production systems in many other countries that depend largely on annual crops. In Ireland, we have many natural advantages, such as a plentiful supply of rainwater and a temperature climate providing ideal conditions for grass growth for most of the year. Food Harvest 2020 stresses a smart, green, sustainable approach to production. Minister Simon Coveney has recently put plans in place for a new agri-food strategy up to 2025, and sustainability will again be at the heart of that new strategy. It will build on a very strong foundation laid in implementing Food Harvest 2020. An independent team of consultants have been procured to carry out an environmental analysis, including strategic environmental assessment and appropriate assessments for 2025 strategy. I understand that they are now at a scoping phase of this process. Origin Green, which is a key element of Irish agriculture and food policy, develops sustainability, enhancing activities at farm and industry level. Since its launch in June 2012, it has been enthusiastically adopted by the food and drinks sector in Ireland. As the first national programme of its kind to be rolled out anywhere in the world, it presents a major opportunity to differentiate Ireland's food and drinks products. At farm level, for the beef and dairy sector, there are established sustainability measures built into each inspection. To date, more than 70,000 beef and dairy farms have been involved. Similar programmes will be rolled out over the course of 2015 for pig meat, poultry, lamb, grain and indeed horticulture. My department and its agencies continue to develop innovative measures and programmes, including the Carbon Navigator Initiative, the Pasture Profile Index and the animal health improvements, including compulsory BVD eradication programmes. Reduced production is not a realistic option for Irish agriculture. We are committed to ensuring that the sector continues to grow substantially so that Ireland can play its part in meeting the increased global food demands while having regard to Ireland's climate obligation. If Ireland wishes to remain a world leader in the production, management and meeting of low carbon, high quality sustainable food, then significant efforts will be required to maximise production efficiently while minimising the effects on the environment. Compliance with existing environmental legislation and key policy instruments such as the CAP, especially the Rural Development Programme, will play an important part in underlying sustainable production systems. Ongoing scientific research and investment in knowledge transfers leading to a high adoption rate of best practices at farm level will also be critical success factor in striving towards our environmental goals. Excuse me. Research funded by my department is being undertaken by Teagasc and the third level institutes to determine the national baseline of soil organic carbon associated with grassland soils in Ireland, the subquestrian potential and long-term stability according to soil type, an ongoing commitment and delivery on key environmental targets under the relevant national and EU legislation and strategies, and with international commitments will be a critical success factor underlying Ireland's sustainability credentials towards 2025 and beyond. From an agri-food sector viewpoint, I agree that it's critical that food production systems remain sustainable, thus respecting the environmental sensitivities in farm landscapes, not only in designated areas for conservation, but also in the wider countryside. My department is committed to supporting the ambitious targets for enhanced food production towards 2020 and beyond, whilst also supporting biodiversity. Sustainable production is therefore dependent on maintaining and enhancing this diversity by respecting and optimising the processes which underpin these services, including good nutrient recycling, carbon sequestration, pollination, etc. The revised Common Agricultural Policy aims to encourage sustainable production systems through a range of measures under both pillars of the agreement. Under the new Basic Payment Scheme, farmers are required to comply with numerous environmental standards in order to qualify for payment. The introduction of the new green payment is a key example of this, as well as more targeted priorities for protection and enhancing the environment. This green payment is in addition to the cross-compliance requirement, which consists of two components: statutory management requirements and standards for good agricultural and environmental condition of land. These requirements are standards related to the environment, climate change, public, animal and plant health, animal welfare, and the good agricultural condition of land. The statutory management requirements, in particular, relate to the implementation of the Natura directives, thus aiding the conservation of endangered birds and threatened natural habitats, including wild flora and fauna. Greening comprises of three new components. The first is crop diversification. The second is permanent grassland. And the last is an ecological focus area. Together, these actions will benefit biodiversity, soil organic matters and structures, nutrient management, input reductions, has benefit for disease control and improving habitats and landscape diversity. While these measures may have an apparent low impact in Ireland compared to other member states, this is credited to the fact that many farmers in Ireland are inherently green by definition, due to the predominance of grass-based production systems and the extensive network of hedgerows in Ireland. The new low green carbon agri-environmental scheme, commonly known as GLOS, is the key measure providing a multiple selection of actions with environmental benefits across a wide range of areas. The tiered design feature of this scheme ensures that a more balanced uptake of actions delivering on a range of environmental priorities with a particular focus across three areas: biodiversity, water quality and climate. Priorities include Natura habitats, mandatory actions for certain farmland birds, commonages, organic farmers, as well as priority access for farmers in high-status water sites, as well as actions for farmers implementing certain climate-beneficial actions. Identified vulnerable water areas and climate actions are also targeted. There are also a range of general actions, some with multiple environmental benefits. Examples of the key action include traditional hay meadow, hedgerow actions, woodland establishment, arable margins, riparian margins, board and bat boxes, and solitary B actions. The inclusion of mandatory requirements in relation to record keeping, the involvement of an agricultural advisor and consultant, and the requirement for nutrient management planning will ensure targeted delivery and greater efficiency. Other elements of the Rural Development Programme with benefit for environmental sustainability include organic farming schemes, which is published this week, and targeted locally led output measures which aim to promote the development of locally focused projects designed to respond to environmental challenges. The nitrate directives required every member state to review their national action programme at least every 4 years. The current regulations were introduced by the then Minister for the Environment, Community and Local Government, Mr Phil Hogan, following an intensive expert review process, jointly chaired by the Department of the Environment, Local Government and the Department of Agriculture. The review aimed to support efficient farming, while at the same time support the delivery of improved water quality. A number of key changes included the revision of phosphorus limits for grazing and silage production, greater clarity in the definition of soil water, and revised allowances for certain arable crops. A number of additional safeguards, including enhanced buffers, were also introduced. We also have the Nitrates Directive, which requires farmers to comply with a stocking rate limit of 170 kg of nitrogen per hectare per year. This is the equivalent of 2 dairy cows per hectare. Ireland's application for renewal of the derogation, to exceed this application limit and apply up to 250 kg per hectare, was approved in February 2014 by the Commission. This derogation is justified on the basis that the majority of Ireland's agricultural area is grass, which has a long growing season. There are high rainfall levels which help to dilute any losses, and our soil breaks down potentially harmful nitrates.
To conclude now, Minister, yeah? Just
almost atmospheric. That's basically at the end of it. I just want to thank again the people for their input. There's a huge amount of detail, but it certainly addresses what I think is a hugely important. So you, Chairman, and your members, I want to thank you for your input.
Thank you, Minister. The next speaker is Deputy O'Keefe. You have 10 minutes.
Good morning. First of all, I'd like to compliment the Chair of the Committee, Andrew Doyle, the work he has done on this particular report, and for leading the committee into producing yet again another important report. And of course, what we're looking at here is something way out into the future. I think it's interesting to look at the actual figures. And 66% of the land usage is farming, 16% is wetlands, 10% is forestry, 1.6% is settlements, and 5.4% is other lands. So if we take farming, forestry and wetlands, we're well over the 90%. And of course that's very important, because that land is there as a carbon sink, and also we have a lot of other advantages with it. Now I think one of the things that's become more and more apparent is that land is not just for farming, that the singular use of land is not true anymore. So we start looking at land in general. What do we do with it? We farm it so we produce food. But we also use land to sequestrate carbon, in other words, carbon sinks, because we use it for forestry, etc. And when we grow crops, such as renewable energy crops, you're taking the carbon in. Third thing we use land for are views, just looking at it. And that's very important. You ask any planner in any county or any county councillor about land, and they'll tell you that there are these areas of high visual amenity in every county. The farmer doesn't get paid for it as a landowner, but it's a very important use of land. And we spend a lot of time and effort trying to protect, particularly focal views, but also the look of the countryside. And the fourth use of land is recreation. And that has become a bigger and bigger issue. And it's about 10 years ago now since we started really recognising that the use of land for recreation is very, very important. So I think we have to accept that we have a multifaceted and at times competing uses for land, and that land, any one piece of land, can be used for very, very different reasons. Now, when we look at land use, the environmental impact is becoming more and more important. The fact that the European Union has indicated that to comply with our environmental conditions that we'd have to reduce the beef herd by 35% and the dairy herd by 5.5% would be an utter disaster. Our country suits animal production. The best crop of all we grow, the most efficient, the most cost-effective crop we grow is grass. To be quite honest, I think all of us know that it's very, very easy in Ireland to grow grass. It'll grow in the tarmac even for you if you give it half a chance. And therefore, to say that an economy that's grass-based would have to cut back massively on its animal production is, to my view, unreasonable. But there's no point in us saying a thing is unreasonable when, on the other hand, we do have to recognise that Europe as a total will have to comply to quite stringent climate change regulations, and that we will have to control climate change. And that brings us to the much more complicated issue that's going to rise in the European level, and that is the need to say that those who should continue to produce animals, to rear animals, and I don't believe that we'll be all eating carbohydrates. In other words, I do not believe that animal production is going to disappear and we'll all stop eating meat. Maybe the amount of meat we eat will not increase all the time, but meat will be part of the human diet, I think, into the foreseeable future. But by right, Europe should look at the total resource of Europe and say that the places where meat should be produced are the places where you can do it most efficiently from an environmental point of view. And that in laying out the environmental targets from agriculture, that they should take into account the efficiency at which each region can produce animals and beef